Hi, everybody. Hey, Angie. Thank you for that intro. It's really good to see you. My sister's texting me right now saying that you're making her cry. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on. I put my Joe Harris shirt on for y'all today. I want to start off by telling you my favorite voter story, and then I'll just talk about election protection for a second. So in 2016, I joined a campaign for the first time. It was a campaign for Representative Sam Park. He is our first Korean-American Democrat elected in the state of Georgia, our first openly gay man elected in the state of Georgia. And I met Sam through a dinner party that a mutual friend held. And when I saw him, I thought, oh, wow, a young progressive Asian man running for office in Georgia. I have never seen such a thing. I'm going to do everything that I can to help this candidate win. He was running against a 3-term Republican incumbent who outraced him by a 3-to-1 ratio, and everybody told us we were going to lose the race. Nobody had ever heard of Sam. Nobody had ever heard of me. But in our scrappy AAPI immigrant ways, we built a grassroots campaign, and one of the main tenets of our campaign was making sure that we built a strong coalition of Black, Brown, Asian, and progressive whites. We were one of the only and first campaigns in the state of Georgia to use in-language outreach in a way that was effective to voters, including Vietnamese voters. We had all of our mothers on the phone banking. We had in-language lit, in-language canvassers, and that was really critical to reaching out to voters that are typically overlooked by both parties. So in 2016, my sister Fee, who introduced me to the Pivot Network, she and I were canvassing for Sam Park, and we were doing door-to-door for Vietnamese voters. Now, both of us can understand Vietnamese. We can speak Vietnamese enough to have a 3rd grade level conversation. In fact, our parents and their friends always say that we sound like Mỹ Trắng, like an old Mỹ Trắng man when we're speaking Vietnamese. So we knock on the door of a voter. He was an older Vietnamese man, and we were able to make conversation with him. He had lived in the district and in the state of Georgia for 40 years and had never voted before in his life. He, in fact, did not know the difference between Hillary or Trump. He did not know the difference between Sam Park or his opponent. So my sister and I spent some time with him at the door, and we said, why don't we connect you to somebody who is fluent enough in Vietnamese who can explain to you the differences between these candidates. We called our friend Benny, and Benny had a conversation with this voter, and the voter said, I want to go vote for the first time, and I'm going to be casting my vote for Hillary, and I'm going to be casting my vote for Sam Park. But he was also afraid to go to the polls because, as you all know, voting for the first time can be intimidating, especially if English is not your primary language. And we also know that there are barriers for people who don't speak English as their native tongue when it comes to voting. So we said, no problem. Benny, Fee, first of all, picked Benny up because Benny has a visual disability and was unable to drive. So Fee picked him up and then drove him to the house of the voter and picked the voter up. And then Fee babysat the voter's young children. And then Benny and the voter went to the polls and voted for the very first time. It was an 80-mile round trip to ensure that voter felt safe and comfortable and confident in casting his vote. That is why it is so incredibly important, the work that you all are doing, and it is really challenging. It is also really eye-opening when we think about voters who've lived in this country for 30, 40, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, or all of their lives, and they don't understand the differences between the two people at the top of the ticket, especially when the differences are so drastic. Y'all play a really critical role because if you're not doing it, the parties certainly are not doing that. That has been true traditionally, not just in Georgia, but in many other states and nationally as well. If it weren't for y'all, we wouldn't be investing in AAPI voters, period. And we also know that we're not investing in the way that we should be with AAPI voters. So I want to thank you for having that leadership because here in the state of Georgia, I am the only Asian American Democratic woman out of 236 elected officials. And I get called upon by the party all the time to do everything Asian related, no matter what, no matter in my district, no matter if I can speak the language. But let me tell you that the strategies that we use in uplifting our voices and making sure that we're a visible population works. So for example, our Democratic Party of Georgia has hired a voter protection hotline person who will be working elections for Vietnamese people full-time from now until January. You all probably got the call to do that because, as we know, when coalitions are not really doing the work, they don't really know that many Vietnamese people. So, of course, I got the call. Do you know anyone who can work our voter protection hotline? And then I passed it on to my sister, and then she passed it on to some of y'all. So I am happy to report we have somebody that is going to be doing that full-time with the Democratic Party of Georgia, and that is simply something that would not have happened 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago. There's so much stuff going on with voter protection and elections, and it's hard to summarize it. So I'm gonna do my best and just give you all a few points that I think are critical, both in the states in which you're working and nationally. I sit on the Governmental Affairs Elections Committee, and every single piece of legislation I've seen in the past 3 sessions have been ways to suppress the vote and make it harder for people to vote. It is very, very rare that we see any kind of elections reform. And in fact, the only progress we've been able to make in Georgia has been a result of litigation. So for all of you litigators and attorneys, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. There are days in which I start to lose faith in our system. And then I think about all the lawsuits that are ensuring that we have some balance of power while we have the president that we do, and while I live in a Republican trifecta state, such as the state of Georgia. So I'm just gonna go over some quick points for y'all because I know that we are on a schedule and I wanna be respectful of everyone's time. So the first main important thing that everybody on this call should be doing, and everybody on this call should be talking to when you contact voters in any state. Every single person needs to make a plan to vote and make a backup plan. As you all know, in the June primaries, in the primaries earlier this year, in Georgia, it was in June, we saw a number of voting disasters. And in the state of Georgia, there were over 8,000 voters whose ballots weren't counted because they arrived after Election Day. When we tried to pass legislation or suggest emergency laws to change the way in which absentee ballots are accepted and provide a 72-hour grace period if the ballot is postmarked by Election Day and received within 72 hours, we were rejected. Ultimately, a lawsuit was filed and won, but the Secretary of State is appealing that lawsuit. So though we are working on litigation, we're still uncertain in terms of how we can protect voters when it comes to something like that. So for people who are procrastinators like myself, we have to break that habit and remind everybody to do the same. So here's my election plan. I've requested my absentee ballot. I'm still waiting for it in the mail. I've signed up for our voter tracker system that will email me and text me every step of the way and let me know where my ballot is. It is allegedly on the way, but I haven't seen it in the mail yet. If I don't get my ballot by October 12th, which is the first day of early voting in person in Georgia, I am going to go to the polls, cancel my ballot, and vote in person. So everybody have a plan, have a backup plan, and tell everybody else to do the same. 2, educate yourselves as much as you can on election laws in your own state and in the states in which you're targeting voters. I know this is a big ask, but because election laws are constantly changing and they're complicated, oftentimes if you don't understand election laws, your right to vote will be suppressed. We have seen it at the polls. It almost happened to our own mom, in fact. Luckily, Fee stepped in and informed my mom of her right to vote and what happens, what she needed to do next, and then convinced her to go back and cast her vote in 2016. That ask is high, but you can sign up for voter education webinars that are hosted by various voter rights groups, and make sure that you understand them to the best of your ability, including things like what happens if a polling place gets extended and you're in line, but the poll worker tells you you can't vote on a machine? What happens if you go to your polling place and they tell you that you have already voted by mail, but in fact you haven't? What happens when there's not access to a translator who can drop your ballot off, who can assist you with ballots, all those type of things. So because that is complicated, if you don't have the time to educate yourself on elections laws, then I would encourage you to figure out which organizations in your state are doing voter protection work and save that cell phone number in your phone. When you are doing outreach to voters, I would provide them with that phone number and say, if you have any questions at the poll, if you have any questions along election, call this number and they will help you with your ballot. For Georgia folks, it would be the Vietnamese voter protection hotline. That way, if you're unable to answer any questions, you have people who are working around the clock to make sure that elections laws are carried out as they are. And quite honestly, we see a lot of mistakes that poll workers make, so it is really important to keep those numbers in your phone and provide them to voters. Third, I would volunteer as either a poll watcher or a poll worker. We know that the pandemic has taken a lot of people ability to work the polls off the table because of their age, and typically we do see poll workers that are older. In Georgia, we have new voting machines, and it was harder for older poll workers to understand the technology of how to set those machines up, how to troubleshoot them, and so we do need younger people to be working the polls. If you don't want to be a poll worker, being a poll watcher is equally important. Poll watchers are responsible for ensuring that election laws are carried out, and poll watchers are also really critical in lawsuits because we rely on their testimony and we rely on them to share the stories that they've seen at the poll. We also rely on them legislatively because when they do see issues, it can help inform us on what legislative laws we need to change at the state. The last thing I want to ask everybody to do is to dispel the myth of voter fraud. That is a messaging piece that the right has been using to discredit our voting system and to cause people to lose confidence in voting, both by mail and both in person. But specifically, the vote by mail messaging has been that it is a program that is ripe for voter fraud, and that is simply not true. We know in this country, voter fraud happens very rarely, and most instances of voter fraud are accidental. This is true across the aisle. This is true in every single state. There's just simply no evidence. So make sure that when you are talking to voters who have questions about that, or if you need to counter some arguments, especially the ones that we see around social media. One is Republicans love vote by mail. They have always used vote by mail. They in fact have used vote by mail in the state of Georgia more than Democrats have. Two, the president is voting by mail and they have their own vote by mail campaign. And three, we know that even though voter fraud exists, voter suppression exists, and that our democracy is fragile, we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we get out and vote. And the last ask I have is, my Vietnamese father is voting for Trump this year, and I have emailed him and asked him not to do that. I have given him points on that, so if anyone wants to volunteer to phone bank my dad, let me know. We have a voter I need to flip. Thanks, y'all.